Tell you something. If you two ever bother me again the rest of my life, I ain't giving up that shit. I can't. There's good friends of mine out there fucking shit. Well, he's the boss, you have to do his part. That's why I said to you before, you don't understand what the money is. I want to know that the boss is your boss.
To finally wrap up the the Philadelphia Mob series. It's been a fun series, and I know other people wanted me to go much further, but there's other stuff I want to get to, and I think really that once Bruno's murdered, it all kind of goes downhill a little bit in a lot of different ways, but we're going to jump right into it. So last week we talked about the ebb and flow of the Philadelphia Mafia and how Angelo Bruno was moving up the ladder. All the murders that had taken place showed that Bruno could be goaded into violence. I don't know if I clearly spoke this last week, but Angelo Bruno being forced to commit murder himself, only after others refused to do it for him, it sort of made him look bad. It was a slight against Bruno. And remember, Bruno didn't have the tacit power to ask anybody for anything, really, because he was a soldier. And nothing more. And while favors for others often happen in the streets, the mere fact that they laughed at Bruno and refused to do it showed a lack of respect and regard for him, which is why Bruno grabbed the burner and handled it himself. And if you think about it, that's how it should have been, considering that Bruno had pretty much been on his own from day one. The other issue facing Bruno was that while he was feared to some extent, the sheer amount of informants now talking about Bruno made any insulation he had almost impossible. But as we know, he had a serious run, so obviously the information provided by informants to the police and feds was only enough to get him on their radar. The guy's hatred and anger for Bruno often overrode their fear of getting killed for talking to law enforcement about him. And so the disdain train started. And as we mentioned before, Tony Caponegro wanted him dead back in the 1950s. And he was not alone in those sort of feelings. Guys were jealous, envious, and they just couldn't stand him. And what we also know is that Bruno had a crew around him willing to do about anything. They would crack heads and take care of more sinister jobs for him, which says a lot in some ways because he was just a soldier. Perhaps the biggest point of contention with guys on the street was the perception that Bruno had bought his way to the top and wouldn't stop until he reached a crescendo, and guys wanted him dead before that could ever happen. And that's what basically makes Bruno begin to look outside of South Philadelphia. And as we said last week, he saw guys on the corner as guys that were going nowhere, having zero ambition, and he wanted to be around people that had ambition. And no matter where Bruno went, the heat was on. So in 1957, Joe Ida goes to upstate New York for the Appalachian meeting. Bruno, as a result of that meeting, was sent a subpoena from the state of New Jersey to testify as to what he knew about that meeting. And Bruno wouldn't have known much anyway, because he wasn't invited and he wasn't there, but because so many had been giving his name to law enforcement, it was just a natural move for investigators to ask him questions. Had Ida wanted Bruno to go to Appalachian, that had been one thing, but he didn't. Number one, Bruno was just a soldier. And number two, and probably more specifically, Joe Ida didn't want Bruno to gain any more friendships with guys in New York. And the headlines hit the papers, and then the fought for hearings mentioned Angelo Bruno's name, and he was added to a top hoodlum list. And look at this situation sort of like Salvi Testa and Nicky Scarfo. Same sort of fucking dynamic. And even though Bruno tried to avoid the subpoena, he eventually lost his attempts at shutting that down. And he goes and he simply stands there and doesn't utter a single fucking word. And it also slowed his desire to become boss. He still wanted it, but he had to slow it down considering all the heat that was coming. And even after that infamous meeting, You would have thought that Joe Ida would have gone underground, and he did a little bit, but he tried to pay zero attention to what Bruno was saying and doing. With the meeting interrupted midpoint in Appalachian, there needed to be more discussed, and there was actually 2 more meetings that would take place after that. 3 weeks later, they would meet in Miami to finish up business, and Bruno was not invited to that, nor did he attend that. The Philadelphia Mafia's representative at that meeting was Skinny Razor. And, that's sort of a statement to Bruno that he had no clout or power in Philadelphia, which is exactly what, Ida was trying to sort of prove there. And even with all the money that was going back up to New York, it didn't buy Angelo Bruno any power or clout in Philadelphia. Even with all the cops, judges, and magistrates in Bruno's pockets, it didn't get him any further up the ladder with guys in South Philly. Bruno wanted the respect, but he wasn't getting it. However, with that money flowing back and forth, it got him respect and it got him favors back in New York City. And if push came to shove and Ida tried to move on him, he expected New York to step up and stop it. So in 1958, when Joe Ida and Pete Casella get pinched for massive narcotics indictments, Ida takes off and flees and goes back to Italy. And that opens the doors for mass treachery in Philadelphia. With Ida back in Italy, Antonio Pollina grabs the reins, and in perhaps a sign of what was to come, he doesn't elevate Bruno. Rather, he chooses to elevate Ignazio Denaro. And Denaro is flanked by Joe Regnetta as his consigliere. And Pollina got what he wanted, but he feared that Bruno was not going to stop meddling in business and not stop pressing to become boss. And Pollina also feared at the same time that New York and Bruno were way too close for comfort. And now this is going to be a bit conspiratorial, but what has been said to have happened is that Pollina, as early as 1957, put the word out on the street that Bruno was to be killed. Now, it wouldn't be until 1958 that Bruno was allegedly told that Pollina ordered Bruno's death and handed that contract to his underboss, Ignazio Denaro. Bruno tried a slow but steady approach to Pollina. He explains he wanted to move to Florida, doesn't want any problems. He wants to operate from Florida. And that was a way for Bruno to release the pressure valve with Pollina. And it was meant to show that Bruno had no intentions of becoming boss. He's playing him. And obviously that's seen through. Maybe it only stifled Pollina for a bit, but Pollina then begins to badmouth Bruno all over Philadelphia. And the problem facing Pollina was that people saw him worse than Joe Ida. And so the tide that was really against Bruno began to sway just enough away from Bruno to make Pollina start to worry. Ignazio Denaro is, worried about another war in Philadelphia. And it's been said that he tells Bruno of the plans. Now, whether or not that's true, I don't know. As I said, this is a bit conspiratorial because I don't believe that Denaro ran to the commission. I also don't believe that Pollina was that stupid to be so open about a murder contract either. However, it was said that Denaro gave the information to Bruno, then drove up to New York himself and told them of Pollina's plan. Denaro allegedly explained the issues to the commission and that they were irate because Pollina needed to request their permission before killing Bruno. They explained it was against the rules and they told Denaro to tell Pollina to come see them at once. Just after that, Bruno was brought in and he explained that he had done nothing wrong and was shocked at Pollina's actions and explained that the horrible lies Pollina was putting out on the streets about him. It's then been said that once Pollina arrives in New York, he denied the whole entire thing and they explained he could not kill Bruno and that was it. End of the meeting. Then, according to the legend, they sit down with Bruno again, asking him if he wanted to avenge himself. And he explained no, that he would not murder Pollina in revenge. Like I said, that's the legend. And there's a lot of problems with that story. A lot of holes in them, a lot of protocol was broken. And even if Bruno was sending money back, there was just a protocol to everything that happens. And so what really did happen? What's the likely truth of the whole matter? Well, number one, let's take into consideration that everything, the totality of it all. Having a rank in a crime family is a big thing. Number one, Pollina was the boss of the Philadelphia Mafia. In reality, he can kill whoever the fuck he wants in Philadelphia because Angelo Bruno's not a captain. He can do whatever the fuck he wants because Bruno is not anybody of any rank. He's just a soldier. The only reason why New York would even take a stance is because of the money that's flowing back to them. That's the only reason why, if Pollina wanted to kill Bruno, might likely have to clear that. And Pollina hadn't been a boss long. And yes, we do know that he was putting out slander against Bruno, but that's how the streets operate. It's a loud whisper campaign. That's all it is. What we do know is that Pollina was worried because of Bruno's abilities. Like Bruno or not, the guy knew how to earn fucking money. He showed he was willing to be violent. However, Bruno doesn't have the backing of the rank and file in Philadelphia. And that's the backing that he needed if he was going to make a move. So from the New York side of things, Bruno knew it was a safety. He had a safety net in certain ways. And that was going to play out he was going to play that out as long as he could. He wanted to be the boss, but he wasn't about to kill a boss in Philadelphia to do it. He knew better. So with Pollina worried because the rank and file wasn't exactly warming up to him being boss and Bruno sending crates of cash back to New York, something has to be done. So what I think happens is I think he does begin to badmouth Bruno. I don't think there's a stretch to that. And putting those seeds into the soil works in reverse for Pollina. I think had Pollina been much different than Ida, I think it worked more for him. Instead, this kind of works in reverse, and Pollina knew it. And I think Pollina also knew that killing Bruno would be met with a furious rage from New York City. I don't think Pollina was that stupid. I've never thought he was that stupid. He's a smart guy. He knows how this works because it's a quick way to get yourself killed and in a hurry. So what I think went down was a conversation between Pollina and Denaro on what to do about Bruno. I don't think Pollina handed down a murder contract. I think the issue was discussed, and I think murder was on the table. But I don't think it went much further than that. It's a guy venting, a guy pissed off. I'm going to kill this prick. What do I do? Blah, 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 blah. I also do not believe that Denaro ran with that information and told Bruno or the commission. I just think it was a venting table talk. That's all it was. And listen, this sort of lends itself to that belief, right? The streets talk, the streets gossip more than you know. And I'm sure Bruno started to hear whispers. And Bruno also isn't a stupid guy. He knew how the streets operate, and I'm sure with Pollina bad-mouthing him, he began to see it for what it is. Well, this guy might try to kill me down the line. I don't think Denaro went to New York City either. I think Denaro simply backed up what Bruno said. In fact, I think Bruno himself reached out to Carlo Gambino explaining the situation, and that's exactly how I think this went down. Remember, these guys are all collecting barrels of cash from Angelo Bruno, and they saw in Bruno a guy who could handle business, a guy who could handle himself, and he's looking for protection, and that's exactly what he's going to get. I think that's really exactly the way it went down. I think Bruno reaches out to Gambino. Gambino informs the commission that they have a problem. They call Pollina, and then they rule against any idea of Pollina doing that, and I think that was the end of it. I don't think they offered Bruno the opportunity to kill Pollina either. I think that's all fucking nonsense. And why would they? Had Pollina crossed some imaginary fucking line? No. He was the boss of a family, and the commission was not going to side against a boss and then tell the protagonist of that boss, you can kill him if you want. Like, they're going to sit down with Pollina and say, listen, just let it go. Get along, but then they're going to go behind his back and tell Bruno, hey, you want to kill him? It just doesn't happen that way. I think really it was the opposite. I think Bruno was told the issue's dead, it's over with, leave it alone, and there will be no retaliation. That's the end of it. This idea that somehow Bruno acts regal in this moment and appeals to the commission like an old world boss, giving Pollina a pass, to me, it's a fucking joke. He had no standing to even say that. He was a soldado. He was a soldier, nothing more, nothing less. And what Bruno does is he uses drama to get himself a shield long enough to put himself into a better position. And what it shows us in neon green, blinking, is that the stability of that family was in deep trouble. And it just seems, and listen, go back and listen to our previous shows, that since Sabella, for the most part, it was all downhill. In fact, once you move past Bruno, Testa, Scarfo, Stampa, Natali, Joey Merlino, this shit just flows downhill. And think about it for a second. Bruno controlled unions. Testa controlled them. Scarfo controlled them. And after that, it was over. After that, what the fuck did they control? The fruit market? That's about it. They went from Sabella to Merlino and becoming the laughing stock of organized crime, and very quickly. They're still ferocious because murder has always been Philadelphia's exclamation point. It's never changed. So when Ida does flee, he wanted to name Ragnetta the new boss. But that move was not supported by the rank and file, and this is why he names Pollina. Plus, Ida had no respect for Bruno, and he felt that Pollina could keep Bruno in place. Nobody liked Bruno. Ida was seen on the streets as a boss who allowed the family to wither and lowered the standards of the mob in Philadelphia. So in 1958, New York steps in and recognizes that things in Philadelphia are about to get out of hand, and they force Pollina to step down. Now, what's interesting here, and what might lend itself to some of the conspiratorial beliefs that I have, is that Bruno gets named boss. And what does he do? He immediately names Ignazio Denaro his underboss. And this is exactly why I said that I think Denaro just backed the right horse when he was asked, if that even happened. Why else name the guy your fucking underboss when it's been alleged that Denaro was handed the murder contract? It doesn't make sense. It smells, and when things smell, there's usually a hint of treachery involved. And I just don't think it was as deep that the legend sort of makes it out to be. So with Bruno taking over and with Pollina still alive, that hurts Bruno's reputation. It made Bruno look soft in many ways. Guys on the street expected Bruno to kill Pollina. He doesn't, and we know why. It's because New York tells him he can't do it. Pollina was done, and that was it. That was the greater embarrassment. But the problem for Bruno, which was different from other bosses prior to him, was the fact that Angelo Bruno was not a feared fucking guy. Guys like Harry Riccobene, Skinny Razor, Frank Sindone, and Frank Narducci were fucking feared. Absolutely feared. And the other facet that hurt Bruno in Philadelphia was that his refusal to murder after becoming boss, and his main focus was money. And guys on the streets were irate that he was lining his pockets, then lining the pockets of New York, and they were starving. And it's that sentiment that ultimately gets Bruno killed decades later. After all, New York made Bruno a boss, not Philadelphia or Jersey. New York made him a boss. So in 1959, something happens to the mob on a whole spectrum. While Angelo Bruno had invested in Cuba, the fact that Fidel Castro chased out Batista and the Mafia was a huge loss financially for the mob. Using Cuba as a gambling mecca and narcotics hub brought the mob $1 billion. And now it's done and over with. And while many of the bosses were scrambling and furious, Bruno took it in stride and began to push north. He made further and deeper relationships in New York, both with Italian and Jewish mobsters, and had many business dealings with them. Bruno would begin to expand, and he would go on to control all of the gambling in the city. He would even begin to move into high-stakes crap games and put John Casablanca in charge of those rackets, which were located in New Jersey, specifically Mount Holly. Bruno not only had issues with the rank and file, but he was getting caught left and right on wiretaps. And when I first sat down to do this, I was going to include all of those. But it's just so far-stretching and so voluminous. The fact is, it's not going to paint a different picture than we already know, and that's why I'm not going to do it. Otherwise, we'd be here another 16 weeks. However, there is some stuff that is dated in 1961, and it shows how Bruno would use judges to hem up the people that he was pissed off with. And I'm going to read right here from the 1961 informant said that on this day, he also told him that Salvatore Maggio's brother-in-law, who had been stealing from them, was named Pat Alvincano. The informant states that he spoke with Angelo Bruno about what Salvatore Maggio should do about the issue with Joe Maraglia and also Frank Palermo, who had also been stealing in the past from the Maggio brothers. The Maggios were Angelo Bruno's brother-in-laws, okay? It was said that Maraglia was bullheaded and that he should be beaten up, which would soften him up in the future and he would make Sam and Tommy willing to pay for what they had stolen from the Maggio company. Informant added that Bruno told him that Joe should be beaten in Philadelphia because if people who were to beat him should be apprehended. Bruno and his associates would get those individuals before a judge with whom they have influence. He also said that Bruno mentioned if they would use daylight and bumper for the beating if necessary, if the judge thing didn't work out. So this is Bruno ratting people out. He says, fuck this, let's go to the cops, we'll rat them out. Then when they get in front of a judge, I'll pay off the judge, they'll get convicted, they'll be out of the way. But if that doesn't work, I'm going to use bumper, I don't know who bumper is, or daylight to beat the shit out of them if it doesn't work. And so it backs up what I've said about Bruno, about how he would rather have problems arrested and sent to prison versus any sort of violence. And it's weird considering this guy would pick up a burner and do it himself. And it just shows that Bruno in his own way was a snitch. Bruno in 1961 would expand his legitimate enterprises tenfold, especially down in Florida with Santos Traficante's permission. And a percentage of that would go back to Traficante. From clubs to restaurants to cigarette vending machines, Bruno just began to expand, and he expanded vastly. He would expand his exterminating business into Miami with Santos Traficante as his partner, and he also moved heavily into loan sharking in Miami. Bruno also would expand into the Caribbean and into the Dominican Republic, operating casinos. One particular casino in the Dominican Republic, which was called Coney Island, was a huge moneymaker for Bruno. However, on March 7th of 1963, the Dominican Republican government representatives walk into the casino and they seize it because the contract between the casino and the workers were up. And the Dominican Republic government officials knew that Bruno owned it. And Bruno was shrewd to some extent and saw this coming down the pike. And he actually purchased the land next to Coney Island in case this happened. And he decided that he was going to build and relocate and build another casino, but that never comes to fruition. Then there's this whole thing about Bruno and boxing. And I'm going to read this directly from the FBI files. Jersey vending company arriving about 12:30. Bruno left shortly thereafter in his car, taking as a passenger Paulie, last name unknown, who drove a vehicle with the New Jersey license plate GBV 950. Bruno held a conversation with Palermo that day, and according to the source, later that day talked with George Katz, who had received 10% of the gross receipts of the fight between Sonny Liston and Patterson. Katz indicated to the informant that when he received the check, training and expenses incurred by Liston were not deducted, leading Katz to the belief that Blinky Palermo was trying to obtain part of his check for the training expenses, but that Katz indicated to him that he wasn't going to tolerate it. Confidential informant PHT2 on February 1st of 1963 stated that close friend of Bruno's told him that Bruno had told George Katz to forget about his dissatisfaction with the above-described check and that Bruno had been in touch with Jerry Catania in regards to Katz's check for his share of the receipts from the Liston-Patterson fight. Katz, according to this source, was supposed to meet Bruno and discuss this problem further on February 4th of 1963. Confidential informant T1 on April 7th of 1963 advised us of the following. He observed George Katz picking up Ralph Schwartz, who works in the offices of Penn Jersey Vending Machine Company, which is owned by Angelo Bruno. T1 stated that George Katz was griping about Jack Nylon and Mort Witkin. It appears that Witkin is desirous of having Katz sue Jack Nylon, an alleged advisor for Sonny Liston, because Nylon made the statement to the press that Liston is free of Liston will then be free of all racket associates. T1 also stated that Katz alleged that he had proof that $10,000 was paid under the table at the time Championship Sports consummated the contract for Westfall Liston match. Further, that Tom Bolin of the Championship Sports was willing to testify that he never gave Katz any money to get the contract. T1 indicated that Katz alleges that Frankie Carbo is not satisfied with the $20,000 Samuel Sappy Margolis, business associate of Blinky Palermo, paid Carbo to buy Carbo's share of Sonny Liston. Liston was said to have formerly been owned by an individual in St. Louis. Frank Carbo, Sappy Margolis, and Palermo. Katz believed, according to this source, that Palermo was using Angelo Bruno for protection against Frankie Carbo. It was also said that Palermo runs to Bruno for advice. It was further said that Bruno had set aside $40,000 for Palermo to take over. It was also indicated that Katz was under the impression that Bruno may have had a piece of Liston. Katz, according to the source, is in frequent touch with James Ryan, a former captain of the detectives in Philadelphia, and is receiving a great deal of information from Ryan. Katz indicated that he did not need Bruno to obtain his 10% of the receipts from the Liston-Patterson fight because he had legal contract for this, but was hoping to use Bruno's assistance to become the manager of Sonny Liston. PHT1 advised on March 17th of 63 that Katz is very friendly with Harry Caldiner, a U.S. Court of Appeals, 3rd District, and that Caldiner interceded for Katz at the time. Sonny Liston lost his license to box in the state of Pennsylvania. Liston's loss of his boxing license followed his arrest in Fairmount Park on morals charges. Caldiner allegedly called Governor Lawrence on the behalf of Liston through his friendship with Katz. Katz is also said to be very friendly with the Philadelphia court judges Maurice Sparkin, Common Pleas Court Number 2, President Judge Joe E. Gold, Common Pleas Court Number 6, and Emmanuel Beloff, County Court, former municipal court for all of Philadelphia. Informant stated on April 21st of 63 that Nat Frank, who writes a column, Frankly Speaking, The Observer, which is a periodical published for the liquor trade, indicated to the informant that Frank Blinky Palermo and Samuel Sappy Margolis recently expressed to their wives as to who should manage Sonny Liston. Margolis did not want Katz to return as manager of Liston, whereas Palermo wants Katz to be the manager of record for Liston. And there's some other stuff like that, whereas Angelo Bruno was caught on a wiretap calling Sonny Liston the N-word, saying he doesn't listen to us, he owes us money, he's the N-word, et cetera, et cetera. But there you go. That's Bruno's being involved in Sonny Liston, which I had heard before. So while Bruno becomes a major player in organized crime, there's just too much out there to just catalog and make it fit correctly. Bruno went from being nothing to the boss, making his family, or really more so himself, powerful. And while Bruno had become the most powerful boss that he wanted to be, underneath of him, for the most part, was a motley crew of imbeciles. While there were some gems in the family, including Frank Narducci, Frank Sindone, Skinny Razor, and others, the problem was most were fucking inept. Same problem they have today. They had zero acumen, and the family looked like a toppled Jenga game. And while I could go through and show you just how powerful Bruno had become, it would take incredibly too long to do. So you guys can type in Angelo Bruno FBI files and read them for yourself. I try to give you the rise, the middle, and the end. Like I said, you can look at the Bruno files for yourself. But we've given you his rise like nobody else ever has. So for a decade, while Bruno's being watched nonstop, he had pretty much remained unscathed. But in the 1970s, that's going to bring about some major issues. Casinos would open in Atlantic City, and while New York wanted a cut, Bruno absolutely refused. It was his turf, and there was no way that New York was going to infiltrate that. While Bruno did, however, give the New York Mafia some concessions. They were allowed to bookmake and they were allowed to loan shark in Atlantic City, and he would get a kickback from that, but they could have no access to the casinos themselves, and money had to come back to his pockets. And because we've mentioned it a million times, I'm not going to regurgitate all of the events, but I'm going to try to retell this differently from sort of a street perspective. So in 1976, when Carlo Gambino dies, Bruno really loses all of his power for the most part. He was insulated by the fact that Gambino and him were very close. They vacationed together, had businesses together, but that friendship kept Bruno alive because at the time there were guys in South Philly that were tired of him. And so this is really a domino effect. So in 76, Gambino dies. Paul Castellano takes over, and he never liked Angelo Bruno. He was never a fan of him, and I think Castellano himself felt that New York should be getting a cut of Atlantic City, but Castellano didn't press. Also at the time, the Gambinos had an entire wing of the family move a ton of narcotics, as we know, to Cherry Hill Gambinos run by John Gambino. Castellano works out a deal whereby the Cherry Hill guys set up a base of operations, and Angelo Bruno's getting a huge kickback from the sales of letting the Gambinos work in his area. And the problem there is that guys within the rank and file want to get into the meth trade because meth is a big thing and it's a big moneymaker. And a lot of guys wanted to move on to drugs because it provided them a lot of money. And with Bruno controlling everything, guys wanted to make more money. And if Bruno basically bans narcotics from South Philadelphia, so in other words, the African-American gangs that were slinging drugs in West Philadelphia were kicking back to Bruno. So the rank and file are like, okay, you won't let us sell drugs, but you're taking profits from West Philly, from North Jersey, and you're letting the Gambinos collect. And what also doesn't help Bruno is the fact that he allowed New York mob families to loan shark and bookmake in Atlantic City. Like that's a huge issue, which once again, that's Philadelphia turf. Adding to that was the cops and indictments coming down left and right to the rank and file, and especially Tony Caponegro. It looked like Bruno was lining his pockets and allowing other crime families to encroach on their turf, and that was out of line. And after Joe Regnetta dies, Caponegro goes from being a captain to a consigliere. Caponegro, who loathed Bruno going back to the 1950s, tried gaining support within the rank and file in South Philadelphia. And what many don't know is that even though Bruno refused to allow guys to sell narcotics, many were doing it behind his back, including Phil Testa, Tony Caponegro, Harry Riccobene, and Raymond Mortorano. And it raises an interesting question here, because if Testa was moving narcotics behind Bruno's back, and knowing what we know about Testa not exactly being the brightest crayon on the fucking box, one has to wonder if Testa knew about this or if he was in on it to some extent. Testa's the underboss. And surely if he wasn't and Caponegro pulls the lever, surely Testa by his rank of underboss would have ascended the throne. And I don't think he would have allowed Caponegro to take over. Therefore, there might have been a war as a result of that, but that's just more of an idea based on what Testa was doing versus any fact that could support any summation or theory. So Caponegro wants to kill Bruno. He knows he needs support in New York. Now, why on earth he thought that they would support that is based probably on an idea that New York wanted access to Atlantic City, and that's always been the bottom line for New York. And I think likely that it was the thinking on Caponegro's behalf. He wants to move drugs. He wants he wants a bigger cut of John Gambino's operation from North Jersey, and maybe he opens up Atlantic City a little bit for New York and takes a kick. In New York, takes a kickback probably in turn for allowing them to turn sideways if he kills Bruno. And as we know historically, he reaches out to Funzi Thierry. And Caponegro and Thierry, they don't have a great friendship either. And there was a beef going way back to the 40s and 50s when Thierry tried to encroach into Caponegro's turf. And as we know, there was a sit-down called, and Caponegro wins that beef, and Thierry never ever fucking forgot it. So when Caponegro approaches Thierry with the idea of hitting Bruno, Caponegro is playing right into Thierry's hands. And what Thierry truly wanted was Caponegro's North Jersey gambling operations, which were worth millions and millions of dollars. And he also figured that if he plays Caponegro, he can also move into Atlantic City without any fucking problem. So Thierry tells Caponegro he'll send it up to the commission. A few weeks later, Thierry calls Caponegro and he says, greenlit, go ahead and do it. Now, there is going to be some debate as to where Thierry stood as far as rank within the Genovese family because of the way the Genovese crime family ran its front boss system. The debate is, was Benny Squint Lombardo the boss or was Vincent Gigante the boss? And I'm here to tell you that in 1980, Vinny Gigante was the boss. Make no mistake about it. Benny Squint by that time was really just a front boss, and the acting boss on the streets was Funzi Thierry. And it simply meant that Thierry had the power to ask. He had access to the commission through Lombardo and Gigante. And that's why Caponegro probably went to him to begin with. He's got the big guy's ears. And what Thierry does is this. He tells Caponegro, go ahead, kill him. And on March 12th of 1980, Angelo Bruno and John Stampa are sitting in a car just adjacent to Bruno's house on 10th and Snyder. They're talking, and Bruno rolls down the window to toss out his cigarette. As soon as he flicked his cigarette and he kind of turns back around, he's shot in the back of the head with a shotgun. The pellets would rip into Bruno's head and blew off the side of his face, and his teeth were littering the dashboard and blood squirting all over the windshield. And Stampa took a little shotgun blast pellet damage, but nothing that required much attention. Angelo Bruno was dead instantly. And here's what's interesting. The FBI was actually following Caponegro that day all day. And immediately after that murder, they were looking all over for him, but they couldn't locate him at first. And the FBI paperwork about this you can look up for yourself, but they knew he did it. Somehow they just knew he did it. It just meant that people were talking. Ultimately, they find Caponegro. Guess where he was? He was coming out of the house of Phil Testa with Frank Narducci. Call it a coup? Maybe. A few weeks later, the commission demands to hear from Caponegro regarding what happened. Caponegro goes to New York. And how did they even know he did it? So Caponegro goes to New York, and when he's asked what the hell happened, who authorized this, he explains, well, Funzi Thierry. Thierry denies it, much to Caponegro's shock. But it's not going to matter because Caponegro is never going to leave that meeting, and he would be found in the Bronx in the trunk of his car naked with money stuffed in his mouth and ass. And anybody that was associated with that hit on Bruno was found as well and showed signs that they had been tortured for days before being killed. And the rest, as we say, is history in Philadelphia. In fact, history just repeats itself. And while Bruno had his intelligence, his acumen for business, and friendships was second to none, he just didn't have the ability to intermingle with the rank and file. That was his biggest problem. Money was his prime motivator. Always was, always will be. And the friendships and the bonds that he bought, in the end, didn't protect him the way he thought it would. And while he was different from other bosses and relatively probably the most successful boss financially in Philadelphia's history, the longest serving boss, he forgot the most important aspect of the streets. Protection does nothing to you when your own men want you dead. New York protected him in the 50s from Caponegro. But after the death of Gambino in 1976, it was over with. And there is an aspect of Bruno that I didn't mention because it's just too long. But it's been said that Bruno was involved in the JFK hit. Apparently, Bruno was caught on a wiretap talking about killing Kennedy and explaining to an underling he wanted John Kennedy dead. And if you look deep enough, you can find a ton of files where Bruno met with many of the players in 61, 62, and then in 63 before the assassination. And it's long been asserted that he was a player in all of that, but there was nothing that ever could substantiate his involvement other than his own words. And it's also worth noting that Harry Nig Rosen, who was insanely close to Bruno, said some really interesting shit. He got caught on a wiretap and was saying that he hoped he could kill Kennedy. And here's a direct quote from the FBI paperwork. "I hope I get a week's notice. I'll kill him. I'll kill him right there in the fucking White House. Somebody's got to get rid of this asshole." Trafficante was also caught talking and said, "Mark my word, this Kennedy is in trouble and he will get what's coming to him. Kennedy won't make it to the election. He's going to be hit." So the reality is, a lot of guys were caught talking. But once again, wanting somebody fucking dead and just pissed off and agitated and saying shit that gets caught on wiretap doesn't mean you truly have the capability of pulling it off. And there's always going to be assertions, but facts will always speak louder than assertions. So while Angelo came into the mob a nothing and never truly got the credit that he felt he was due, his own ineptness and snobbery is what gets him killed in the end. He was often called the docile Don. But in reality, it's a machination that allowed the window to be open just enough for the ghosts of yesterday's past to exact what Bruno himself had done at least 10 times. And say what you want about Bruno, but for all the acumen in the world, the one thing you can't ever forget about the streets is how you got there. The second you lose focus of what keeps the streets aligned, that is the very thing in the end that will kill you. So there you have it. We are going to take next week off. I will try to get some stuff on YouTube in the interim. But let me know what you thought about the Philadelphia series. Reach out to us at mobtalkradioshow@gmail.com.